The wind came down from the red sage hills in dry bursts, carrying red dust that settled on everything like a fatigue no one could shake off. In those years, the Montana Territory promised nothing but calloused hands, workdays that burned the lungs, and dreams left in the corners of wooden rooms. The town lived on the silver mine to the north and the cattle operations to the south, two sources that drew men in and drained the women little by little. Inside the Red Sage Saloon, thought by some to be warm, though it was only a den of coarse laughter and liquor heavy as lead, Althea Rivers moved between tables, an old wooden tray shaking slightly in her hand. The dim oil lamps cast a yellowed sheen across her face, showing the tired lines deeper than her 24 years. Her work dress was patched in too many places, long enough only to hide legs worn by dust. Her shoes were so thin she could no longer tell where the soles ended and the ground began. She moved by instinct, dodging sudden hands, sidestepping glued-on stares, avoiding jokes dull as the air itself. The men called her by every name they pleased, though none of them truly saw her. They saw a server, hands that poured their drinks, a body built to endure. She leaned forward to place a beer on the fourth miner's table when Micah's cough cut through her memory again. Her younger brother, only 18, lay in a cramped wooden room at the edge of town, fighting for breath under a sickness the doctor said required $2.75 worth of medicine. For some people, that was a meal. For her, it was a week of working until her bones trembled. A group of drunk men lifted their glasses. Someone called out behind her, "What do you want most in the world, Althea?" She stopped for half a beat. A worn-out smile opened on her face like a rusted hinge. She answered softly, just loud enough for them to hear and for herself to bear. Just a day off. The whole table roared. One man slapped the wood so hard the glasses rattled, the sound hitting her chest like something cracking. Maybe they thought she was joking. Maybe they couldn't imagine a young woman so tired that a single rest day felt like an impossible wish. She laughed along out of courtesy, then stepped back, chin lowered, heart heavy as if filled with ash. Behind the counter, she set her tray down and rubbed her aching wrist. Garrett, the saloon owner, gave her a brief look, something like concern mixed with the helplessness of a man who knew her struggle but could offer nothing except more hours. Then, just when Althea thought the night would drag on like every night before, loud, long, and empty, the saloon doors opened. Light from outside cut across the room in a thin slice. Laughter slowed. Several men turned. Garrett straightened. The air shifted enough that Althea lifted her head, and she saw him. Boon Callahan stood there, coat shoulders dusted from the road, broad hat shadowing part of his face but not the presence that tightened the whole room. He owned Callahan Cattle Company, the land beneath half the town's boots, the respect of miners, and the wary eyes of every rancher for miles. No noise from him, no theatrics. Yet Red Sage Saloon seemed to change color around him. Althea had never seen him up close. She had only heard his name in stories thick with exaggeration and fear. People said he was handsome. People said he was cold. People said he was richer than the silver mine itself. None of it prepared her for the moment his eyes met hers. Just a second. But it felt like the room lost its air. She stood still, her hand still wet with beer foam, her heart stumbling once. He stepped inside fully and closed the door, a streak of wind following him before fading out. Althea Rivers, who had learned to survive days worn down to the bone, did not understand why, in that brief moment, she felt seen for the first time. Not as a saloon girl, not as a moving shadow carrying drinks, but as a person. Boon Callahan walked toward the counter. No one spoke, and the air truly seemed to stop. Boon Callahan stepped fully into the saloon as if he carried the outside sky with him, a cold, clean layer that stood apart from the heat, liquor, smoke, and clutter. He had been there only a few seconds when the usual noise of red sage fell by half. The loud man from earlier went still, tightening his grip on his glass, as if afraid to disturb the landowner. Boone looked at no one. He ignored the cautious nods from the men who knew him. He walked straight to the wooden table in the right corner, one no one dared sit at unless Garrett allowed it. He took the chair, removed his gloves, set his hat beside him. Every motion was slow and deliberate, the kind of control built over a lifetime. Garrett stood behind the counter, tugged at his vest, then jerked his chin toward Althea. "Serve Mr. Callahan." Althea froze. A flush of unease tightened her chest. Her dress was worn, its hem visibly frayed. The apron carried 2 dried streaks of spilled liquor. She felt like a child dragged in front of the most powerful man in the region. "Garrett, maybe go. He'll just place an order." There was no way out. Althea drew a quiet breath, lifted the tray, and walked toward Boone's table. She tried to steady her steps, but the closer she came, the smaller she felt. He was not like the other men in the saloon. No alcohol drifting off him. No crude talk. No dull, cutting stare. But his eyes. She sensed them before he even lifted his head. She stopped beside the table, her voice low. "What would you like, sir?" Boone looked up. His gaze was not grasping, not measuring, not sliding over her like she was a cheap object in the corner. It simply held, steady, deep, without offense. For the first time in months, Althea felt as if she were not performing a role. He said quietly, "Whiskey. No ice." She nodded, though her fingers trembled slightly on the tray. She stepped away, wanting to escape that gaze. But when she returned to set the glass on the table, he was still watching her, with the same calm intent that made her heartbeat misstep. "What is your name?" Boone asked, his tone so even she almost mistook it for a question aimed at the air. Althea blinked. Wealthy men did not ask the names of saloon girls. They pointed. They signaled. They never cared who brought their drink. "Althea." "Rivers," she said, stumbling on the words. Boone nodded once, lightly, as if he would remember without needing to repeat it. "Thank you, Miss Rivers." 3 simple words, but in a room filled with emptiness and drunken chatter, they sounded like something too decent, too measured. Her throat tightened. She turned away faster than planned, focusing on the other tables. Yet each time she passed the corner, she felt Boone's presence, though he never waved, never called her back. He was simply there, and that alone weighed on her chest in small, sharp pulses. Near closing time, when the saloon noise rose again, Althea gathered empty plates. She approached Boone's table, keeping her eyes down. As she reached for the wooden plate, her hand brushed his, skin to skin, a brief touch, her whole body stilled. Boone studied her, his voice low and plain. "You're exhausted. I can see it from here." Her heart tightened. A hand she could not see pressed against the defenses she had built for 2 years. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever looked past the forced smile. She could not speak. She bowed her head, lifted the tray, and stepped away so quickly she nearly dropped a glass. When she returned to wipe the table, Boone was already gone. He had not said another word, had not looked her way again. But on the wooden surface, beside the empty whiskey glass, lay a $20 gold coin, bright enough that her fingers shook when she touched it. Not charity, not a bribe. Something else. Something that warmed her chest, then chilled it in the same breath. $20. A full month for her and Micah. Althea stood still, staring at the space Boone had left, feeling the story of her life shift in a direction she could not tell was danger or hope. The gold coin stayed in Althea's palm the entire walk home. It was heavier than she expected, not only because of its worth, a month of living, a round of medicine, a few full meals, but because of the mix of feelings tightening her chest. Gratitude, fear, caution. Each emotion pulled her in a different direction, stretching every step along the dark dirt road. The night wind passed through the tall pines, carrying a thin, hollow howl. Red Sage did not fully sleep, but it quieted enough for her to hear her own tired breath. Her cabin stood 3 blocks from the saloon, tucked behind dried sage bushes. The wooden door had warped from weather. She had to shove her shoulder against it to get it open. Inside were a small bed, an old table, 2 uneven chairs, and a cast-iron stove missing a leg. Nothing extra. Nothing enough. The moment she stepped in, Micah's cough split the silence. He lay on the narrow bed pushed against the wall, thin to the point a breath of wind could have moved him. His face was pale, lips cracked. "You're back," he rasped. Althea set her scarf down and went to him. Her hand touched his forehead, hot. The cough shook his frame hard, rattling his weak chest. She poured water, lifted his head, and brought the cup to his lips. He took a small sip, eyes closing as if it drained the last of his strength. "I'll get your medicine. Tomorrow." Her voice was so low she wasn't sure whether she said it for him or for herself. When he finally slept, she sat at the table and lit the small oil lamp. The dim light caught the gold coin, making it shine like something that didn't belong in this stripped-down life. She set it on the table. It rolled once, metal striking wood with a sharp, clear sound. She stared at it as if it were a question without a possible answer. What did Boon Callahan want? To appear generous? To place her in his debt? Or was he simply a decent man in a cold landscape? She couldn't trust the last idea. Life rarely offered kindness without a cut. The lamp's glow pulled up another memory, her father, with rough hands smelling of soil and cheap opium. He had worked the silver mines near Denver, where small explosions were as common as shifting winds. One large blast took him and 5 others. No compensation, no apology. Only a wooden box of dust-covered belongings. Althea went still. Those memories lived behind her like a shadow. At dawn, when the sun was still thin and cold on the eastern ridge, Althea walked into the general store. She held the coin tightly, the first time in months she didn't have to count every cent. "The strongest cough medicine, Mr. Harris," she said. The shopkeeper looked up, surprised at the faint brightness in her eyes. He was wrapping the medicine when the bell at the door chimed. Someone stepped in, and Althea sensed the change in the room before she turned. Boon Callahan stood by the doorway, light behind him cutting the angles of his face. His gaze swept the shop once, then settled on her, quiet, direct, as if he had hoped to run into her. "Is Micah any better?" he asked. His voice was low and steady, not intrusive, yet enough to make her hand tighten around the coin. She startled. How do you know his name? Boone tilted his head slightly. I asked Garrett. Their eyes met again. A small silence opened between them in the smell of new cloth, as if the room paused to give space to the moment. Mr. Harris lowered his head quickly, pretending to count coins. Then Boone spoke, his tone even, making his offer cut sharper. If you agree, I'll set up a line of credit for you here, for when the boy needs more medicine. Something in Althea braced itself. She straightened, eyes reddening briefly, voice sharp. I'm not someone you can buy. He didn't flinch, didn't bristle. He only held her gaze longer, as if trying to speak something she wasn't ready to hear. Then he nodded once, as though respecting the thin thread of dignity she clung to. Althea pressed the medicine to her chest and left the store quickly, her heartbeat loud from anger, fear, and something else she refused to name. In the week that followed, Red Sage Saloon seemed to change its rhythm. At exactly 8 o'clock each night, no earlier, no later, Boon Callahan walked in. He made no noise, sought no attention. He simply opened the door, gave Garrett a small nod, and went straight to the same table in the right corner. The bell above the door became a kind of signal. Drunk men straightened in their seats. The other servers stopped whispering and fixed their aprons. Everyone reacted except Boone, the only one who treated it as an ordinary routine. As for Althea, she tried not to look. She slipped between tables, carried trays, dodged wandering hands, ignored whistles and half-slurred remarks. She kept her eyes pinned to her work, as if one misplaced glance might pull her into something larger, stranger, and more dangerous than she could handle. But no matter how she avoided him, she still felt Boone's gaze each time she passed his table. It was never inspecting, never hungry. It was simply attention. Quiet, steady, set on someone who deserved to be seen. One night while she fixed bottles behind the counter, Garrett leaned in and murmured, "He comes here for you, Althea." She jolted hard enough to nearly drop a bottle. "Don't say things like that." Garrett lifted a brow, half joking, half serious. "Rich men don't read books in saloons." She glanced over, and it was true. Boone sat alone with a book open on the table, the leather cover worn, his finger holding a place on the page as though he had paused only because he heard her steps. Smoke, glass, and shouting seemed to blur behind him. She turned away quickly, too quickly. Yet on the 5th night, while Boone was reading, she found herself standing beside his table before she had time to ask why. "What are you reading?" Her voice was softer than she intended, shorter, thinner. Boone looked up and his eyes, still as the lake north of town, met hers. "Poetry," he said quietly. Then he pushed the book toward her. Althea hesitated, but reached out. Her fingers brushed his. Just a faint touch, light as dust, but strong enough to halt her breath. She lifted the book. The leather was soft from years of use. "You read poetry in a place like this?" Boone answered without shifting tone. "There's room for a little silence anywhere." The line struck something in her. He wasn't speaking to sound wise. He spoke because he meant it. She turned a page. The lines were spare, clean, full of empty spaces, like her own life, always filled with gaps she had to bridge on her own. She returned the book, touched him again, stopped breathing again. When she walked off, the other servers had already noticed. "Althea, Watch yourself. He's taken an interest in you. Men like that don't choose girls like us." Their whispers followed her all night. Her face burned, part shame, part confusion. She didn't want to seem like someone aiming too high, but she also didn't want to think about Boone too much, though her heart had already done that for her. Boone spoke no further to her that night. He read, occasionally lifting his gaze just enough for her to realize she was being watched, but never in a way that made her brace herself. He treated her as an equal, not as a saloon girl. That frightened her more than it comforted her. Near closing, when the crowd had thinned and only the wind pressed through the cracks in the door, Althea went to clear Boone's table. He was gone, leaving without a word. On the wooden surface lay another $20 gold coin. She stood still, her hand trembling. For some reason, the coin felt heavier tonight, so heavy that when she closed her fingers around it, tears fell onto the table before she could stop them. She wiped them away quickly, afraid anyone might see, but no one noticed. The whole noisy saloon missed the small break inside her. Only she knew. Her life had started to shift, far away, very slowly, like a small stream finding a new path, and Boon Callahan was the first wind that pushed the water forward. Saturday night was always the wildest at Red Sage Saloon, but this one rose beyond all the others. Laughter, shouts, fists hitting tables, a piano striking uneven notes, everything blended into a coarse din like the gravel road outside. The air was thick with sweat, strong liquor, and smoke. Althea had barely stepped out with a tray of beer when a drunken group near the door burst into loud howls, filling the room like a wave. At the center stood Clayton Redstone, a freight hauler known for heavy drinking and heavy hands. His eyes were red with bourbon, his breath sharp with its bite. "There she is, my pretty little saloon girl," Clayton slurred, stumbling toward her with an arm reaching wide. Althea sidestepped him, keeping her voice steady. "I have other tables to serve, sir." But Clayton didn't let her go. His hand clamped around her wrist, a hard, ugly grip. The noise around them thinned. "Stay a minute," he muttered. "You owe me a little fun tonight." Althea pulled back. No use. He tightened his grip. Her nails dug into his skin, but he held fast. For a moment, an old fear washed over her, the trapped feeling between beer-stained tables and hungry eyes. She tried to breathe steady, but her pulse slipped out of control. Her hand trembled. "Let me go, Mr. Redstone." "Oh, someone this pretty? Why would I?" The men nearby paused mid-drink, but none stood. They only watched, waiting to see where the trouble would land. And then, through the crowd, a tall figure stepped forward. Boon Callahan. No one heard him rise. No one saw him move. He simply appeared, as though the room made space for him on its own. He walked through the cluster of men with a calm, deliberate stride. Not hurried, not tense. Each step pushed the air aside. Althea sensed him before she saw him. A shift in the room. A presence. Boone stopped behind Clayton. He didn't shove or yank. He only set a hand on Clayton's shoulder, light as placing a coin on a table. But his voice told a different story. Low, cold, dangerous. She said no. The last two words cut sharp. Clayton turned, ready to bark, until he lifted his gaze and saw Boon Callahan staring down at him. The smug grin fell off his face. A heavy silence slid across the saloon. Everyone knew Boone wasn't a man who sought trouble, but he wasn't one who stepped away from it either, and no one in Red Sage was foolish enough to challenge him. Clayton released her, fast, as though burned. Althea stepped back, hand pressed to the skin reddened by his grip. Boone didn't spare Clayton another glance. He turned to her, slow, steady, directing all of his attention toward whether she was hurt. "Come with me." His voice wasn't harsh, just firm. He extended a hand, not to hold, not to claim, just clearing a path so she could walk ahead. Althea followed, though her legs shook. Boone walked behind her, blocking the eyes that tried to follow. They stepped out the back door. The cold night wind struck her face. No crowd, no noise, only their breathing. "Are you all right?" Boone asked, his voice lower than usual. Althea nodded, though her heartbeat was loud enough she feared he could hear it. His gaze on her wasn't pity. It wasn't possession. It was concern. A kind that made her want to back away and step closer at the same time. "You didn't have to do that. I did it because I wanted to. No one lays a hand on you." The space between them was small, very small, only inches. She looked up, without meaning to. Boone leaned in, without meaning to. For a heartbeat, their breaths touched, eyes locked. The silence thickened until she could hear the first drops of rain hitting the tin roof. A sense of safety slid through her spine. A sense she hadn't allowed herself in years. A sense that frightened her. Garrett suddenly pushed the back door open, making both of them step apart. "Althea," he said quietly, like a warning. "Remember, Boon Callahan lives in a world you don't belong to." Boone's eyes shifted slightly. Althea said nothing. She left the saloon in the first rain of the season, her thin dress soaked, her dust-covered shoes sinking into mud. Each step was cold to the bone, but inside, she could think only of the inches of space between her and Boone, and his eyes. Eyes unlike anyone who had ever looked at her. The storm had begun in the late afternoon, but it wasn't until nightfall that it released its full weight on Red Sage. Wind slammed against the tin roof as if trying to tear it loose. White flashes split the sky, lighting the small town in sharp, cold bursts. The saloon was unusually empty. The customers had left before the storm hit. Garrett cleaned behind the counter. Boone sat at his usual table. Althea collected glasses, her hands trembling from the cold wind slipping through the door cracks. 3 people, 3 breaths. A room lit by wavering oil lamps shaken with every strong gust. Boone kept watching her, the kind of watchfulness that made it feel as though he heard what she hadn't said aloud. At last, he set down his glass. "Why did you come to Red Sage, Althea?" She froze. A simple question. One that touched a place she hadn't touched in a long time. She set the tray down and steadied herself against the edge of the table. "Nowhere else to go," she said softly. "Why?" Boone asked, not pushing, only wanting to understand. She looked at the lamp flame. Its unsteady light reflected in her eyes, like the nights she spent holding Micah through long fits of coughing. "My father died in a mine in Denver," she said, voice rough. "My mother remarried a man who didn't want us. One day he threw us out. We left with nothing but a bag of clothes." Rain hammered the window pane as if forcing its way into her story. "I took Micah with me. We worked wherever we stopped. Then his sickness got worse." Her voice broke. "Red Sage was the first place that didn't turn us away." Boone watched her for a long moment. Not pity, not sorrow. A quiet understanding, as if something hollow in him had just been filled by her truth. Althea meant to turn away, but a familiar ache gripped her chest. Exhaustion, burden, fear, and years of loneliness. She lifted a hand to wipe her tears when Boone stepped closer, slow, quiet. Each step audible on the wooden floor. He raised a hand, pausing in mid-air, as if asking for permission without words. Then he set his hand on her arm, a gentle touch rare in the harsh West. Her whole body loosened, like a bowstring released after years of tension. Her head dipped, her shoulders trembling. Boone didn't pull her in, didn't hold her. He simply stood close enough that his breath brushed her cheek with every rumble of thunder. A flash of lightning lit their faces only inches apart, her cheeks wet with tears, his eyes shadowed, full of controlled emotion. "Althea," Boone said quietly, "if I touch you, you have to tell me to stop." His voice was so low it felt like breath against her ear. Althea looked at him. Long, very long. She said nothing, and that silence was her answer. Boone leaned in, slow, as if each second was a request. The first kiss touched her lips like a small crack opening in dry earth, unsteady, warm, and edged with caution from two people who had known too much loss. She gripped his shirt. He held her by the waist, lifting her onto the edge of the wooden table, careful, as if she were something he never believed he'd be allowed to have. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, there was only their breaths, the creak of wood, and the storm being pushed back by the warmth of two lives reaching for each other after so many cold years. Boone held her back, his large hand steady, as though shielding her from the whole world. Althea's arms wrapped around his neck, her forehead resting on his shoulder, her breathing mixing with the rain beating against the window. Their mouths met again, deeper, surer, stripped of the hesitation from the first moment. They fell into each other, not from reckless desire but from the unexpected relief of two lives finally finding a place to belong. Then, the back door swung open. Garrett froze in the doorway. Lightning lit Boone stepping back fast, and Althea pulling down her skirt, her face flushed with shock. "Sorry," Garrett murmured, retreating as he shut the door. No one spoke. Only the rain did. Althea stepped back, breath uneven, her heart pounding like the storm crashing against her ribs. She didn't look at Boone again. She turned and ran out into the downpour. Cold water hit her skin. Rain fell hard enough to wash everything away. Everything except the feeling in her chest, a feeling she could not erase. 3 days after the storm, the sky over Red Sage cleared again, but Althea's mind did not. Everything inside her had gone unnervingly still, like a lake so flat that one pebble could expose everything she was trying to hide. She avoided Boone, came to work on time, left the moment her shift ended. When Boone arrived at 8, she pretended to be busy at another table. If he looked her way, she lowered her gaze. If he stood, she slipped behind the counter. No one noticed the change, except Boone, the only one who kept quiet, who didn't chase her, didn't corner her, but whose eyes followed her each time she passed his table, like a silent question. Garrett watched from afar without commenting. He understood. Grown men did not show their feelings. But Boone's eyes darkened night by night. That alone was clear. On the second night after the storm, Althea sat by the window in her cabin. Micah slept. The coughing hadn't stopped, but it had eased. Moonlight spilled over the small table, where she had once placed the first gold coin Boone left behind. She opened her palm, studying the calluses that hadn't healed from long nights of work. Part of her wanted to run. Another part wanted to return to the moment Boone's breath touched her mouth. She had lived too long in fear. Fear of wanting something bigger than she was allowed. Fear of letting anyone near. Fear of trusting a man. But what unsettled her most was this. For the first time in years, she wanted something for herself. On the third day, just as she stepped into the saloon, Garrett called from behind the counter. "Letter for you, Althea." She froze. No one wrote to her. No one even knew where she lived. Except one person. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, the handwriting firm and spare. "Tonight, if you want to talk, I'll be at the old homestead north of the field. BC." No pleading, no explanations, no pressure, only an invitation. Althea folded the letter and slipped it into her apron, but her heart didn't settle all evening. Every step, every glass she set down, every door slamming in the wind reminded her of those words. When she returned to the cabin, Micah sat up in bed, blanket wrapped around him. "Something's wrong?" he asked, voice weak but eyes sharp. "No," she answered too fast. Micah glanced at the paper sticking out of her apron. "Boon Callahan wrote you a letter?" She startled. "Don't say things like that." "I saw it," Micah murmured. "You should go, Althea." She swung toward him. "You don't know what you're talking about." Micah planted his hands and sat straighter, his thin face steady. "I know you've lived like a shadow for years. You fear every small thing, every glance, like you're not allowed anything good." Althea opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Micah continued softly. "I don't know what kind of man Boone is, but I know you only have light in your eyes when you talk about him." A breeze slipped through the door crack, tightening her chest. Truth was sometimes small enough for a frail boy to see. Althea didn't answer. She rose, wrapped a scarf around her neck, pulled on her thin coat. Micah watched her. "If you're afraid, then go and tell him that. Don't stay silent and hurt alone." She stood there a long moment before stepping outside. The sunset fell across the red hills. The last streaks of daylight lay over the field like half-burned threads, orange, then deep red. She saddled the old horse behind the cabin. She didn't ride often, but her hands remembered the reins, the way the horse nudged lightly as if sensing her unease. She climbed onto its back, the cold evening air brushing her face. The road to the old homestead ran quiet along a narrow creek, then ran across a stretch of wild grass. Althea guided the horse slowly. The western sky poured fire across the field, casting her shadow long over the ground. Each hoofstep matched a question in her chest. Was she riding to meet Boone, or to meet herself? And when the old homestead finally appeared at the foot of the hill, an abandoned house burning red in the last light, she knew whatever waited there. This was the first time in years she was walking toward something she truly wanted. The abandoned house rose in the darkening sunset like a memory time had left behind. Wind pushed through the rotted boards, making hollow, thin sounds, like the sighs of a place once lived in, then forgotten. Boone stood on the porch, not confident, not composed, not carrying the posture of the most powerful man in the territory. He only stood there, hands clasped, shoulders slightly bent, as if holding a weight no one else could see. Althea dismounted. She thought she had prepared herself for this meeting. But seeing Boone in the dying light made something in her soften, and something else pull tight. Wary, trembling, conflicted. Boone looked at her, his eyes deep as the old well behind the house. He didn't step closer. He only said, "Thank you for coming." A long silence. Wind moved across the grass, carrying the smell of damp soil and the last chill of the day. "What do you want to tell me?" Althea's voice was low, guarded. Boone drew a deep breath, as if gathering all the courage he had left. "There is a truth," he said. "You need to know, even if it makes you hate me." Althea's heart jolted, fear blooming instantly. A cloud slid over the final strip of sunset. Boone rested a hand on the warped railing, his fingers tightening. "Callahan Company," he paused, "owned the silver mine where your father worked." The air seemed to split open. Althea went still. Boone continued, every word dropping with the weight of stone. "The explosion, the one that killed him, it happened under our ownership." Althea heard the wind, heard her heartbeat, heard the faint sound of truth cutting into her chest. "You're telling me," she stepped back, "your family is the reason my father died?" Boone closed his eyes, as if taking a blow. "I was young then. I knew the mine wasn't safe. I knew there were cracks, risks." His voice thickened. "But I said nothing. I didn't want to confront my father. I stayed silent." Althea gasped, like someone had struck her. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet. "I've lived 5 years with that guilt," Boone said, meeting her eyes without flinching. "And the moment I first saw you in the saloon, I realized I was looking at the consequence of my silence." "Stop." Her voice cracked, losing its hold. "Althea, what do you expect?" Her voice sliced through the wind. "You think I'll do what? Forgive you? Thank you for telling me?" Boone took half a step forward but kept his distance. "I came to you," he said softly, "not out of pity, not to be absolved." His eyes reddened, his voice lowering under the weight of his admission. "I came because I want to make it right. If there's anything I can do to repay what was lost, I will." Althea let out a broken laugh, thin, jagged, painful. "You think it's that simple?" Tears slipped down her face, warm against the cold air. I carried Micah across half the country like a stray. I worked every job, took every insult, just to keep us alive." Her hands tightened, her voice fracturing. "And all that time you just stayed silent?" Boone offered no defense, no excuses. He only stood there, like a man prepared to take every blow she threw. Althea stared at him, the man she had let touch her, the man who had opened something inside her, now standing as the doorway back to everything ruined. Love and anger tangled in her chest, like a wound torn open too wide to bind. "Althea," Boone murmured, "if you want me gone from your life, I will go." Wind scraped the roof. The sunset died out completely. She couldn't look at him anymore. She turned, walking fast, each step landing like she was stepping on her own heart. "Althea!" Boone called, not chasing her, only letting his voice fall into the wind. "Wherever you go, know this. I was wrong, and I will pay for it to the last of my days." She didn't turn back. She couldn't. Tears mixed with the cold wind, tasting bitter on her lips. She crossed the darkening field, leaving Boone alone before the ruined house, like a man weathered down by life's storms, still standing, waiting for forgiveness. But tonight, the truth had cut too deep. In the days after the meeting at the homestead, a dry, scraping wind swept through red sage as if trying to erase every trace of the old storm. But inside Althea, another storm kept rising, persistent, fierce, with no way out. She still worked, still carried trays, still wore a thin smile like wet paper. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Boone standing on that porch, his gaze heavy like a man carrying an old wound, and somehow choosing to place it in her hands. Part of her wanted to hold him. Part of her wanted to push him so far away she would never see him again. It was the thinnest line she had ever walked, where love and hatred lived one breath apart. While Althea struggled to steady her heart, Boone stepped into the hardest days of his life, not hiding, not avoiding, not letting the past lie still like a shadow. He did something no one else had dared to do in years. He cleared the names of the miners who died in the explosion. 3 days to convince the town council. 5 days to recover the records. Nearly a week to issue a new report, stating the collapse was caused by mismanagement and ignored safety warnings. Althea's father's name, Henry Rivers, was written in bold. Not at fault. The news spread across Red Sage. People whispered, respected him, questioned him, were moved by it. Boone didn't care. He only stood in the drizzle, holding the report, in front of Henry Rivers's grave. Then came the second task, compensation for the families of the 7 men who died. Not a symbolic amount, enough to rebuild the lives that had been broken. He went to each house himself, offering apologies, no excuses, no shields. Some cried, some embraced him, some pushed him away. Boone accepted all of it. Then came the hardest work, reforming the entire Callahan mining operation. He fired 4 negligent supervisors, brought engineers from Helena to inspect the geological structure, established strict safety rules. No one went underground without clearance, not even him. "You're the first man crazy enough to stir up this hornet's nest," Garrett said when he heard. Boone only answered, "I let people die because I stayed silent. Now I fix it by speaking." But there was one thing he could not bring himself to do: cross the threshold of the small cabin at the end of the street. That door had never opened. Many nights Boone stood outside Althea's cabin in the cold. He didn't knock, didn't call her name. He only stood there, as if a man guilty was allowed to ache, but not allowed to enter. Some nights brought rain. Some nights brought wind that carried sand up to his ankles. Some nights he stayed until dawn, his shadow long and thin under the pale moon. Neighbors saw him and turned away. They knew this wasn't a matter to step into. Inside the cabin, Althea stood behind the door, her hand pressed to the wood. Her heart pounded until it hurt. She heard his footsteps, heard his breathing, felt the weight of a silence that seemed to press against her shoulders. Part of her wanted to open the door, to tell him she had seen what he'd done, to ask why he stood there, cold, tired, humiliated, when one word from him could make the whole town bow. But the other part, the part that had lost a father, been thrown out of a home, carried Micah across half a territory, held tightly to fear. If she opened the door and let Boone into her life, would she lose everything again? Her hand trembled. Her back hit the wall. Tears came without sound. Micah woke sitting up in the dim room. "He's here again?" he asked. Althea nodded. "Are you going to open the door?" She bit down on her lip, shook her head. Micah let out a long breath, the kind that didn't belong to a child anymore. "You're not angry at him. You're afraid you'll soften." Althea broke into silent tears. It was the truth she hadn't dared to admit. Outside, Boone remained. Wind whistled through the narrow alley. The cabin light burned inside, but the door stayed closed. And between a love fighting to surface and a grief sharp as broken iron, Althea stood at the most dangerous place, the line between the two halves of her heart. That afternoon, the sky over Red Sage held a pale gold tint, like sunlight filtered through an old cloth curtain. The wind wasn't strong or soft, just steady enough to make the field ripple in small waves. Althea had just ended her shift when Garrett handed her a folded slip of paper. Not long, not elaborate. Just a few lines in the handwriting she knew. "If you agree, come to the homestead. B." Althea's heart missed a beat. It had been a long time since Boone asked anything of hers. Since the night he stood in the rain outside her cabin, he had not pushed her once. He waited, patient, steady, silent, until she opened her own door by choice. She slipped the note into her dress pocket and walked out like someone listening to the sound of her own heartbeat. When she arrived, the sun was sinking behind the hills, casting a soft copper light across the abandoned homestead. This old place had seen the hardest moment between them. Now, it was calling her back. Boone stood on the porch, quiet as a familiar shadow. The moment her boots touched the ground, he looked up, his gaze meeting hers with the softness of wind passing over grass. "Thank you for coming," Boone said, his voice deep but lighter than it had been before. He stepped down one stair and stood in front of her, not close enough to crowd her, just close enough for her to know he was truly present. "Are you well?" he asked as if he had carried the question through many nights. Althea nodded. She tried to hold steady, but looking into Boone's eyes felt like holding a cup filled to the brim. One small touch and she would spill. Boone drew a slow breath, one taken by a man who had made a decision larger than himself. "Althea," he said quietly, "I didn't ask you here to speak about my faults again. I asked you here for something else." She didn't have time to ask. Boone went down on one knee. The wind paused, sound pulling back as if the land itself wanted to listen. In front of her was the man who had once frightened her, once angered her, once made her want to run, and then became the one who gave her a place to lay her trust. Boone looked up, his eyes steady with a sincerity that didn't put on weight or shine. Not to atone. His voice trembled, the first time she'd ever heard it so. "Not because I think I owe you." He placed a hand to his chest. "But because I have loved you, from the moment you said all you wanted was one day to breathe." The words were plain, honest. They landed so sharply that Althea lifted a hand to her mouth. "I love your strength," Boone said. "I love the way you protect Micah, the way you stand upright, even when life handed you so little." Wind passed through, lifting the hem of Althea's dress. Her eyes blurred. "I am not asking you to forgive my past," Boone said. "I'm asking for a future, one where I can spend the rest of my life making amends, guarding you, loving you." Althea inhaled through tears. "But Micah," her voice broke. I will not leave him. No matter what happens, he stays with me. Boone rose so gently she didn't flinch. I'm not asking you to leave Micah, he said. I'm asking to protect him as family, the way you protected him. A long, quiet pause followed, warm, steady, like a place she had needed for years. Althea bit her lip, her hands trembling. She wasn't afraid of Boone. She was afraid of how much she was beginning to believe in something good. Boone. She looked at him like someone facing a doorway leading into an entire future. I don't know if I'm brave enough to trust again. He didn't rush, didn't press. I'll wait, Boone said, voice low as a vow. As long as it takes. Althea closed her eyes. A tear hit the tip of her shoe. Then she nodded. A small nod, but firm. Let me try to trust once more, she whispered. Boone stepped forward and took her hand as if holding something he never expected to receive. Sunset light covered them, as if the story itself was turning a new page. So, you'll say yes? Boone asked, his voice rough. Althea tightened her grip on his hand. I say yes. And in the quiet of the open field, no applause, no bells, only two hearts, after wandering too far, finally found each other at the moment they needed most. The wedding took place on a cool, early autumn morning, inside the small wooden church at the center of Red Sage. No expensive flowers, no crowded guests. Just a few rows of benches, a soft organ playing, and a thin line of sunlight falling across Althea's hair as she walked in. Her dress wasn't new, a borrowed white cotton gown, fitted at the waist and falling simply to her ankles. But when Boone looked at her, his gaze was quiet, and deep enough to hold every mile she had walked to reach this moment. Boone wore an old suit with freshly fastened buttons. Garrett sat in the first row. Micah stood beside him, leaning a little on the wall, still frail, but smiling wider than he had in years. Their vows were gentle, simple, spoken in their everyday voices, telling each other, from now on, you will not walk alone. Boone slipped a silver ring onto her hand. She placed one on his. No cheers, no noise, only the warmth of his fingers closing softly around hers. Their new life began with the smallest things. Callahan Ranch overwhelmed Althea from the moment she saw it. The fields stretched all the way to the foothills. The main house stood wide and calm. Stables, the old barn, the kitchen yard, the well, everything larger than any place she had ever lived. When the horse stopped at the porch, Boone stepped down first and held out his hand. Slowly, he murmured. Not commanding, just a small, natural kindness. In the early days, Althea felt like someone who had wandered into a world too large for her imagination. But what surprised her most wasn't the size of the ranch. It was its quiet warmth, the steady way Boone kept it alive. In the mornings, he brewed coffee and set a cup in front of her without a word. At noon, he stopped by the kitchen just to ask if she was tired. By evening, he tightened the cinch on her saddle, his hand brushing hers for a moment. No show, no claim, no demands. Only the patience of a man who had chosen to love without causing harm. Micah recovered quickly. Warm milk each morning, stew each night, steady medicine. His weight returned, his skin regained color. You don't have to worry about me anymore, he said the first time he helped her carry water. Althea nearly cried at that. The boy who once lived on borrowed breaths could now laugh, run, and after many years, sleep without coughing. Althea learned her new role, the woman of Callahan Ranch, but she refused to sit still. She rose early, adjusted the kitchen cloths, learned to manage inventory, recorded hay storage, followed Boone to the stables to check on the yearlings. Her first winter there, she sewed gloves for the ranch hands. The next spring, she helped clear brush along the fence line. Many times Boone told her, "You don't have to do all this." She only shook her head. "This is my home. I need to put my hands on it." She never forgot where she came from. Dusty roads, empty nights, hands that were never allowed to rest. That memory kept her grounded, even inside a house far larger than anything she had known. At night, when the ranch settled into silence, she and Boone often sat on the porch, watching the distant lanterns glow from the stables. The wind brushed past, lifting a strand of her hair. Once Boone rested his hand on the back of her chair, almost an embrace, but not quite. "I'm still learning what it feels like to have someone in the house," he said softly. "So am I," she answered. He smiled, rare, but warm enough to carry through the whole evening. One early summer morning, Althea rose from bed and felt something different. Not pain, not fatigue. Just a soft, deep sensation low in her belly. She stood before the wooden mirror, one hand resting lightly on her abdomen. Boone found her still and quiet there. "What's wrong?" he asked, a hint of worry in his voice. Althea turned to him. Her eyes glimmered, not with fear, but with a silent, gentle joy. "Boone." She took a breath. "I think we're going to have a child." Boone froze, as if a wind had passed through him, sweeping away every word he thought he would say. Then he stepped close, placing his hand over hers. Slowly, reverently, as if touching a small miracle. No other words were needed. No vows, no promises. Just two people standing together in the pale morning light, as another door quietly opened in the life they were building. 15 years passed like hoofbeats fading across the prairie, steady, patient, leaving clear tracks without noise. Callahan Ranch changed with the winds and seasons, but the warmth inside the big eastern house remained the same. The warmth Althea and Boone had built together. Something fuller than anything she once dared to dream when she was a hungry girl working nights at Red Sage Saloon. They had 3 children, a 13-year-old daughter who preferred riding horses over sewing, her brown skin glowing under the sun, the same way her mother once glimmered under the saloon lamplight. A quiet, thoughtful boy who loved books and asked Boone endless questions about faraway places. And the youngest, 7 years old, all laughter and quick feet, small enough that strangers felt the urge to kneel and gather her into a hug. Micah, the boy who once coughed until his lips turned blue in their crooked cabin, was now a young man, steady and kind. He married Amelia, the new schoolteacher, and together they taught at a school named after their father, the Henry Rivers School. That school had changed hundreds of working families, not just with clean walls or printed books, but with opportunity. The thing Henry Rivers never had in the mines, the thing Althea carried like an unhealed bruise through her drifting years. A charity fund in Henry's name began as Boone's idea, but Althea was the one who ran it. She knew every family, every child, every name others forgot, she remembered. Each winter she sent rice, medicine, blankets to the workers' quarters, things she once prayed someone would bring to her and Micah when they were cold, fatherless, and alone. That evening, wind drifted from the northern hills, carrying the warm scent of summer grass. Althea stood on the porch, her hand resting on the darkened rail. Her children chased each other across the field behind the house, their laughter stretching wide across the land like sunlight breaking into small pieces. A meadowlark perched on the fence, then darted off. The last light of day spilled onto Althea's hair, turning it a soft amber. She drew a slow breath, the kind that fills the chest with a peace she once believed she'd never hold. The door behind her opened. Boone stepped out, his figure still steady, though strands of silver now threaded through his hair. He didn't speak at first. He simply placed a hand on her waist. Light, familiar, like that stormy night years ago. Althea leaned her head against his shoulder. The scent of pine, sun, and the man she had chosen settled around her like something she'd known forever. "What are you thinking about?" Boone asked, his voice still low, softened further by age. "I'm thinking." She looked at their children running through the grass, "that you never really know when happiness begins." Boone smiled, a rare thing, still warm enough to loosen her heart. He bent slightly, whispering into her ear, "You once told me you only wanted a single day of rest. Now you have a whole life." Althea laughed softly, a quiet sound, deep and gentle, like wind brushing across a still pond. She placed her hand over his where it rested on her waist, squeezing lightly. "Back then, I thought all I needed was one day off," she said. "I didn't know how much peace I truly needed." Boone nodded. "Neither did I. Not until I found you." Wind curled around them, carrying children's laughter, distant hoofbeats, and the warm scent of hay from the barns. Life had never asked whether they were ready. Life simply brought them where they needed to go, and the rest they built with their own hands. Boone looked at Althea as if he were still grateful for every moment she stood beside him. And in that quiet moment, Althea understood. Every loss, every wandering mile, every cold night and unseen scar had led her to this porch, to a place where her heart was finally seen, trusted, and loved in a way that didn't shout, but endured. If this journey touched you, share your thoughts below. If you'd like to travel with more quiet, wind-carried love stories of the West, please like, subscribe, and share this with someone dear to you. Thank you for staying until the end.